Hello everyone! Today we do a speed training, so a practice that is perfect if you can read French, but if you freeze when you try to speak French. And the first thing to know if you want to speak French with confidence is that you don't need more vocabulary. And it has nothing to do with how much you have studied. And I know that lots of you are trying to learn more French words, hoping that you will improve your confidence with more French words. But that's the mistake, because you don't need more words. You need speaking reflexes. And learning more words and more rules won't give you these reflexes, because that doesn't make you practice. Whereas to speak French with confidence, you need to learn and practice at the same time. And that's what we are doing today, with a type of practice specifically made to boost your confidence. So by the end of this video, you won't be translating anymore, but you'll be thinking in French first and speaking. And that's the reflex that makes real conversation possible. So let's build this reflex together. If you're ready, let's go. So today we are going to learn and practice how to say sentences like I was working or you were waiting. These are sentences where you really have to think in French because they are completely different in French. And that's easy with the right method. And to say this kind of sentences in French, you always need the past tense that we call the imparfait. Always. So first, we're going to practice slowly very simple sentences, just in case you need a reminder for the imparfait. And then, to get the reflex to make these kind of sentences in French automatically with confidence, we will do speed training sessions. So a practice where you will have to focus on what you have to say. So you'll get used to think in French. So you will make these sentences in French with confidence. Now, if you already know the imparfait, you can go directly to the speed trainings. But otherwise, let's see how to say to work, to wait, and to be with the imparfait in French. So first, we're going to say she was working in French. So here, what's really important first is that when you want to say she was working and any verb with this structure was working, the verb with to be in English in the past, and then the working, a verb that ends with ing, the ing form. We have was working. This kind of sentences is always the imparfait. So now, how to say the imparfait in French? To say the imparfait in French, you always need first the infinitive form of the verb. So the to form in English, like to work, for instance. To say to work in French, you say travaillais. So here, that's the infinitive. That's really important. That's the foundation for the imparfait. And then, when you want to say travailler with the imparfait, you remove the ending and you replace the ending er by the sound e. AI plus a silent ending. But as it's a spoken French course, I won't be talking about the silent endings. So you just need to remember the e sound at the end. So actually with er verbs, like travailler, it sounds the same. Just travailler. And that's it. So now that you know that, can you say just she was working? Just she was working. Elle travaillait. And that's it. So you see, that's really simple, but it's only one verb, one word. When you say she was working, you have two verbs in English, the was and the working. But here in French, it's really important to focus on the idea that you mean. I'm going to say it again in this video because that's really important. Focus on the idea that you mean. Here when you say she was working, what you mean is the idea of working that you have to say in the imparfait in French. So travailler, elle travaillait. And there's no verb to be in French, never. With the imparfait, just one verb, the idea that you mean. Travailler, elle travaillait. And now can you say, I was working? Just that, just I was working. Je travaillais. And that's it. Same principle. And it's very important that you make the sentences out loud. This method works only if you make the sentences. That's how you will get the reflex to speak French. So first, really focus on the idea that you mean, and then say it in French. But here with the imparfait, so with no verb to be, just je travaillais. Now let's say another verb. We're going to say he was waiting. So we need the verb for to wait in French. To wait is attendre. Attendre. But attendre is the infinitive. So now to say attendre with the imparfait, you need to remove the ending and to replace it by the sound et, which makes attendez. So now can you say he was waiting? Just that, just he was waiting. Il attendait. And that's it. Same principle. The idea of waiting only, no verb to be in French. Just il attendait. Now let's say we were waiting with the casual we or the spoken we. Here when I say we, I always mean on in French. So now can you say we were waiting? On attendait. So same principle, but with the slight subtlety where you have to pronounce the N of on only when just after there's a vowel, when the following word starts with a vowel. And here we have attendez that starts with a. So in this case, you need to pronounce the N of on. So on attendait. Now let's say you were, just were, with the informal you. So here when you say you were, we have actually the verb to be here. So when you only have the verb to be, that's the verb to be that you need to conjugate in the imparfait. So what's the verb to be in French? In the infinitive. The infinitive to be is être. And then once you have the infinitive, that's always the same. You just need to replace the ending by the sound et. So with être, it becomes était. So now that you know that, can you say you were with the informal you? Just you informal were. Tu étais. And that's it. So actually that's quite simple. Just the infinitive and you replace the ending by et. So tu étais. Now can you say I was? Just I was. j'étais. So same principle, but with a slight subtlety again. This time we have je, that is I, but when je is followed directly by a vowel, when the following word starts with a vowel, the je turns into j plus apostrophe, so you just have the sound j, and then directly était, so you say j'étais. And then can you say I was working? Just that, just I was working. Je travaillais. And that's it. But be careful, here there's no verb to be. Here when you say I was working, you mean the idea of working. And that's the idea that counts. So you only say the verb to work in French in the imparfait. So just travailler. Je travaillais. So if you'd like to practice the imparfait further, I have other YouTube videos in the description. But now it's time to practice your reflexes. Let's do our first speed training session. So I'm going to say 10 small sentences in a row. Sentences like we just did. So you really need to focus on the idea that you mean, because sometimes you have to say the verb to be. When there is only the verb to be and you mean the idea of to be, you say the verb to be in the imparfait. But I'm going to mix the sentences, so sometimes you also have to say the idea of working or waiting, only no verb to be. So really focus on what you have to say and say just the idea that you mean in French. So get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? You informal were working. Tu travaillais. She was. Elle était. I was waiting. J'attendais. We were waiting. On attendait. You informal were. Tu étais. You informal were working. Tu travaillais. I was. J'étais. He was. Il était. He was waiting. Il attendait. She was. Elle était. We were working. On travaillait. And that's it. And congratulations. You just finished the first step. So with the structure was working or were waiting, for instance, that is only one verb in French in the imparfait. Now, just one more thing. Here we practice the imparfait from the structure was working or was waiting. But you can use the imparfait in French also when you mean in English, I worked, for instance, or I waited. There are cases where you also need the imparfait. But here, we only practice the English structure was working or was waiting that you have to say in French. And now, let's do some sentences, but that are a bit more complex. We're going to add some words. So first, the word for there. There in French is là. Just là. So now you're going to say, she was working there. And that's it, just that. And that's the same words order. Here there is no trap. You just say there at the end of the sentence. So how do you say, she was working there? Elle travaillait là. And that's it. So you still need to focus on the idea. But here we learn to manage a bit more complex sentences. So just elle travaillait là. Now let's say in the garden. To say in the garden, in French, you say dans le jardin. So here again, there's no trap. It's the same structure and the same words order in French. So in is dans, and then the garden is le jardin. So in the garden is dans le jardin. So now can you say, he was in the garden? Il était dans le jardin. And that's it. So same principle, here you have the idea of was, just being in the garden, so you need the verb to be in the imparfait. So il était dans le jardin. Now can you say, he was waiting in the garden? Il attendait dans le jardin. So first the idea of to be waiting in the past in the imparfait. So il attendait, and then dans le jardin for in the garden. So here when you have more complex sentences, even if it's not that complex, what's really important is to focus on the ideas. But to focus on the ideas one by one. So first, focus on the idea of he was waiting, and then in the garden. And it's going to be more easy to say these sentences in French. So, he was waiting, il attendait, and then in the garden, dans le jardin. Il attendait dans le jardin. Now let's say in the living room. To say in the living room, in French, you say dans le salon. So it's shorter in French. And you use the verb salon, like a salon. So, dans le salon. So now can you say, I was in the living room. Just that, just I was in the living room. J'étais dans le salon. So here you really mean the idea of being in the past. So j'étais with the subtlety of the J that turns into J apostrophe. J'étais dans le salon. And now can you say, I was working in the living room. Je travaillais dans le salon. So same principle, but with the idea of working. Here you mean the idea of working, so no verb to be, just je travaillais dans le salon. And now you're ready to do our second speed training session. So I'm going to say 10 sentences in a row, again, like we did, and you say it in French. Then I say it in French, and we do directly the next one. I say it in English, you say it in French, etc. So here you see that in these sentences, you have more things to think about. So that's really important to focus on the ideas one by one. So let's do this next series. Get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? You informal were working there. Tu travaillais là. She was there. Elle était là. I was waiting in the garden. J'attendais dans le jardin. We were waiting in the living room. On attendait dans le salon. You informal were there. Tu étais là. You informal were working there. Tu travaillais là. He was in the living room. Il était dans le salon. I was in the garden. J'étais dans le jardin. He was waiting in the garden. Il attendait dans le jardin. She was there. Elle était là. We were working in the living room. On travaillait dans le salon. And that's it. And again, bravo. Now you probably feel that you're getting faster. And that's because you're starting to expressing idea directly. And that's the reflex that makes real conversation possible. And you see, for instance, apps can do that. Or any method that makes you learn by heart rules and words. Because here, that's real practice. But of course, You can't learn to completely speak French if you only do these speed trainings. You also need to learn to make more elaborate sentences. But this trains your reflexes. And if you would like to go further, you can check out my free masterclass. The link is in description, and that's a masterclass that goes deeper into the French speaking. But for the moment, let's try to make sentences even a bit more complex, but still quickly. So first, let's say a simple one first to warm up. Can you say just she was there? Just she was there. Elle était là. So now you get it. With the imparfait, être becomes était, so elle était là. But now, let's say she wasn't there. So let's introduce the negation. To say she wasn't there in French, you just need to say pas. Pas that you place just after the verb. So how do you say she wasn't there? Elle était pas là. So just pas just after the verb. Here we do spoken French. In spoken French, there is no ne. If you learned ne for the negation, that's right, but for written French. You won't hear ne in spoken French. Except for very formal speeches, for instance. Otherwise, you just say elle était pas là. Now let's say I was working in the living room. Just that, just I was working in the living room. Je travaillais dans le salon. So again, this one is simple now. Just the idea of working, so no verb to be. Je travaillais, and then in the living room, so just dans le salon. But now let's say I wasn't working in the living room. And here there is no trap. It's always the same principle. So just focus on the ideas that you mean with the pas just after the verb. So in this case, how do you say I wasn't working in the living room? Je travaillais pas dans le salon. And that's it. So with the pas just after the verb. In English, you say was working, wasn't working, but in French, there is no verb to be, just the verb for to work, the idea of working. So, je travaillais, and then the negation, and then the pas just after the verb. So, je travaillais pas dans le salon. Now, can you say, you informal were not waiting in the garden? Tu attendais pas dans le jardin. And that's it. Same principle. With the wasn't waiting, that is the verb attendre in the imparfait, and the negation pas that goes just after the verb. So, attendez pas. Tu attendais pas dans le jardin. And now, let's ask the question why. So, why in French is pourquoi. So now you're going to say, why were you working there? So still with the informal you. To ask a question in spoken French, There are several ways of asking questions, but the most simple is just to say the question word. So here, why, pourquoi, and then the casual statement. So just, you were working there. So how do you say in French, why were you informal working there? Pourquoi tu travaillais là? And that's it. That's already the same principle, but you need to focus on the idea that you mean one by one. So first the idea of why, pourquoi, and then the you were working there. So tu travaillais, the idea of working, no verb to be, pourquoi tu travaillais, and then the there, là. Pourquoi tu travaillais là? So now let's do our next series, the third session. So with these kind of sentences, same principle, I'm going to say 10 sentences in a row and you say them in French. So get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? You informal were working there. Tu travaillais là. She wasn't there. Elle était pas là. I was waiting in the garden. J'attendais dans le jardin. We were not waiting in the living room. On n'attendait pas dans le salon. Why was she working there? Pourquoi elle travaillait là? He was in the living room. Il était dans le salon. Why was he there? Pourquoi il était là? I wasn't in the garden. J'étais pas dans le jardin. Why was he waiting in the garden? Pourquoi il attendait dans le jardin? Why was she there? Pourquoi elle était là? I was working in the living room. Je travaillais dans le salon. And that's it. And now you can notice how by the end of this video, you have rewired your brain. And that's the beginning of thinking in French. That's the missing piece for learners who can read French, sometimes at the B1 level, but who freeze when they try to speak. And that's normal, because if you have the knowledge, but nobody trained you to think in French ideas under time pressure, then in conversation, your brain is too slow and you freeze, because what you like is the automatic reflex. So again, if you're interested, and if your goal is to speak French, not to complete French exercises, but really to speak French with confidence, you can join my free masterclass with the link in description. It's a mix of speed training videos, as we just did, and videos where you have more time to make more complex sentences. So you get to think in French quickly and speak French with confidence. It's a big masterclass that lasts 4 hours, but it's split into 10-minute videos. So it's very easy to do it a bit every day. And of course, there is no rules to memorize, no tables to learn, because it's awful and inefficient. What you need to speak French is to be guided with a smart method. So I guide you, and you just speak French, and it becomes automatic. So you can click the link in the description to get started now. Don't let another year pass using apps and methods that teach knowledge instead of training reflexes. Try the masterclass now while this momentum is still fresh.